Good afternoon, and welcome to the next program in the Liberating Webinar series of the Autistic Woman and Non-Binary Network. My name is Lydia XZ Brown, pronouns they, them, and I am AWN's Director of Policy, Advocacy, and External Affairs. I am a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses, currently wearing a red hoodie in a room with 2 windows with blinds behind me. Today, I am excited to host our conversation on disability justice and Crip Technoscience, racism and ableism in AI and the future of technology. I am pleased to introduce our 2 guests for this conversation today. The first guest is Damien Patrick Williams, a PhD candidate in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech. Damien researches how values, knowledge systems, philosophies, social structures, religious beliefs, and lived experiences of humans can affect creation and use of algorithms, machine intelligence, biotechnological interventions, and other technological systems and artifacts. More on Damien's research can be found at the website A Future Worth Thinking About, and I will drop the link in the chat. Next, I would like to introduce Crystal Lee, a PhD candidate at MIT and fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. She works broadly on topics related to the social and political dimensions of computing, data visualization, and disability. She also conducts ethnographic and computational research on social media communities. Crystal's research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, Social Science Research Council, and the MIT programs for the digital humanities. Previously, she was a visiting research scientist at the European Commission and graduated with high honors from Stanford University. As we start our conversation today, you can access captioning by clicking the button that says CC, and you may then opt to view subtitle or show full transcript. You can also click the link in the chat to access the captions on a separate page. Throughout our time this evening, if you have trouble with the access or technology at any time, you are welcome to send a message in the chat and we will try to resolve that issue as soon as we can. We are also streaming live to Facebook. And if you would like to follow and participate in the conversation on Twitter, you are invited to do so with our hashtag Liberating Webinars. So now, I would like to turn to Damien and Crystal and ask you first if you would each talk a little bit about the work you're doing now and how disability justice shows up in that work. We'll start with Crystal.
Hi, this is Crystal. I'm a youngish East Asian woman with bangs and a ponytail sitting in a green room with pictures of sand and rocks in the background, and I'm wearing a black sweater. So as far as the work that I'm doing right now, I guess like the major project for me is thinking about how to crip HCI. HCI is human-computer interaction, which is, I guess, the study of the relationships between humans and machines, kind of broadly construed. So I guess like the core of this project is really thinking about disabled people both as users, as developers, as people embedded within this larger ecology of technology and computing, and thinking about both who the assumed user is when people design and like make computing technologies, but also like think about what technology is supposed to do and like the way that it's kind of embedded both within a broader political landscape, but also within like the research communities of computer science and engineering itself. So I think in a lot of ways, I'm trying to mobilize insights from critical disability studies, design justice, and critical race theory into a field of computer science in order to think more broadly about how to design better technologies and how to imagine better speculative futures. I'll hand off to Damien.
Thank you very much. My name is Damien Patrick Williams. I'm a youngish black man with some natural hair in the center of my head, shaved sides, facial hair, and silver wire rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a red shirt and a silver paisley tie, and I'm sitting in a room filled with bookshelves, each of which filled with books and decks of cards and figures and knickknacks. My work is focusing on, as Lydia noted in their introduction of me, the ways that human values make their ways into technological systems and artifacts. I think about how questions about the knowledges that people hold or the belief systems of which they're a part make interventions into the things that they do, the actions that they take, the systems that they build, and the way that those beliefs and values then replicate and iterate within the systems and the artifacts, the technologies that they create, that we all are subject to and make use of every day. My work is specifically focusing right now on how marginalized lived experience is impacted by and also can impact and perhaps even make better for a very carefully curated and negotiated definition of what better means, make better the experience and the creation of these technologies. Specifically, again, algorithms, artificial intelligence, biotechnological interventions, things such as prosthetics, even going so far as genetic manipulation technologies and things of that nature. So I think about the ways that, for instance, marginalized religious beliefs, West African religious traditions that were brought over with enslaved peoples during the transatlantic slave trade, find their ways into things such as the way that we have cultural conversations around artificial intelligence these days. Those kinds of perceptions, those kinds of understandings of different types of integrations with the natural and the built, the delineation between the spiritual and the physical. These things can perhaps illuminate and help us to better understand things about the technologies that we all deal with day in and day out.
This is Lydia. In most conversations about AI and algorithms, the topics and the phrases that are the terms du jour are algorithmic bias and algorithmic fairness. And that's even some of the work that I'm doing in my other capacity with the Center for Democracy and Technology. We talk a lot about algorithmic bias or fairness, and sometimes about discrimination. I want to ask the both of you where those frameworks of algorithmic fairness or bias fall short in addressing racism and ableism in AI technologies.
This is Crystal. Damien, do you want to start?
Sure, this is Damien, and I'll say the notion of bias, the way that it does kind of miss the mark a bit, is that in a real sense, bias is just a synonym for perspective, a point of view on the world. We tend to, when we deploy the word bias in our conversations about AI, most people tend to mean prejudice when they use the word bias. And biases in a pejorative sense. But the idea that we could make something that was perhaps bias free, bias neutral is, I think, pretty much a functional impossibility. I think that the real fact of the matter is that human biases are human values, and human values are human perspectives, and human values and perspectives are going to get built into the systems and the tools that humans make. And so the question isn't, can we make these free from bias? Can we make them free from perspective? Can we make them free from values? It's which values, which perspectives, which biases are we going to build into the systems? And that conversation is still one that's not really being addressed. the kind of recognition and acceptance that we're going to build some values into the tools that we make, into anything that we make, tool or not. What values do we want those to be? And to make that a part of the design and the building process.
This is Crystal. I totally agree with everything that Damien said, and I feel like he really encapsulates the problems with the words fairness and bias in a way that I think is so compelling. And so kind of jumping off of that, I think, like, as he said, like it's not about trying to create a system that is bias free because it's impossible, but I think I like the way that I can kind of contextualize this is to kind of think about the promises or the aspirations of what algorithmic systems are trying to do, and then to kind of like calibrate what fairness and bias means there. But I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is how the aspirations and the promises of algorithms in public policy are at once like way too aspirational and not aspirational enough. So when I say that they're overly aspirational or overly ambitious, I think the goal of a lot of AI systems is to somehow optimize for like certain kinds of social outcomes. So optimizing for better policy or like better and more efficient economic systems, better distribution of welfare. And we can talk more about means testing later in the conversation. But I think like when Damien is talking about like which values and which biases we build in, like often these systems are basically about making current social systems more efficient. And I think what really falls short for me, and I think what Damien is getting at, not I don't mean to speak for you, but is that with a lot of these systems, they're not ambitious enough in that when they're trying to optimize for current social systems that often value things like white supremacy, there's no deeper engagement really on what a better social future could look like. So what would a radically different way of organizing a social safety net or organizing society in a way that centers things like disability justice, what would that safety net look like? And so, I mean, I think I really echo what Damien is saying about like the insufficiency of ideas like fairness and bias, just because it assumes that somehow there is a world where there isn't prejudice, or that we could create a system that is fair within the current confines of neoliberal white supremacist society.
This is Lydia. I personally hate using the word bias in these contexts because it makes invisible how systems of oppression actually work by placing the onus of oppression both on individual people who act oppressively and on individual people who are oppressed. On the one hand, implying that if only individual people who act oppressively just decided to become more conscious of it and stop doing it, that would somehow disappear whole systems. And it's not how that works. Or on the other hand, implying that if people who experience oppression choose to fix something about themselves, that suddenly they, in many cases, we, would no longer experience oppression, which is really a subtle way of just victim blaming. But on that first end of it, of how bias makes individual people's actual oppressive actions and divorces them from the systems, structures, patterns, and institutions within which they operate, I'm thinking about the use of the hashtag stop AAPI hate or stop Asian hate, and how I don't use that hashtag. I don't use the word hate because it's not that hate doesn't exist or that there is no room for a conversation about hate, including anti-Asian hatred. But it's that using the word in the context of all violence targeting Asian people because of racism individualizes structural racism. And it instead implies that hate of Asian people can be an individual prejudiced person's problem rather than one rooted in literally hundreds of years of state and interpersonal violence against Asians from many Asian communities, South, Southeast Asian, East Asian, Central Asian, people from the Southwest Asian region, usually called Middle Eastern, and how that violence is tied to and triangulated against other communities of color, Black people, Latinx people of color, Native people, including Asian people who are also part of those same communities. So using the word hate doesn't allow or enable us to have the broader, more expansive conversation that we have to have to confront the root causes and exacerbating factors of that violence. And in the same vein, I don't like the word bias because it carries that same implication that bias is about individual people choosing to be prejudiced or being prejudiced out of their individual ignorance, but allows us to ignore the role that systems, structures, institutions, and patterns play in enabling and perpetuating harm that superficially looks like bias. Now, I wanted to ask another question and draw back for a moment, but before we do that, I think I just saw a dog behind you, Crystal. Is that a dog?
It is. Oh, wait, I got it. Come here. Oh. Oh. This is like, oh, she's very distractible right now because she has gotten a treat so that she remains quiet throughout the entirety of the session. So she's very concentrated on that right now.
Aw, I love her. She is the bestest girl. Uh, can you share some specific examples for those who are newer to this conversation about how AI works, what it does, where it's used in ways that can be racist or ableist or anti-racist or anti-ableist?
This is Damien. Unfortunately, I do have a lot more examples of the racist and ableist and also misogynistic and transmisogynistic and just I have a lot more examples of the negative applications and implications of AI than I do of the ones that are actively ableist, anti-racist, anti-misogynistic, anti-transmisogynistic. And that is, I think, unfortunately, the nature of the conversations that we still need to have, and the lack of certain conversations. A couple of examples that I do think are doing, good work. The project Data for Black Lives, which tries to do work with looking at the history of algorithmic incursions into Black lives, both in terms of the ways that facial recognition technologies get used, but also in use of force recommendations and use of force incidences within police encounters of Black violence, with anti-Black violence for police actions. And so that's one place where people are trying to use algorithms, big data sets, and AI and machine learning to kind of illuminate a pattern and showcase a certain set of data-driven policy recommendations for how we ought to be making changes and where we ought to be making interventions. There are, however, unfortunately, still predictive policing algorithms and predictive policing and facial recognition tools that are being put into place in police forces and military actions, both in the United States and around the world, which, however, are more pervasive. They don't see dark-skinned faces as well. The facial recognition applications don't categorize Black people or brown people very well at all, and they don't actively or accurately categorize quote unquote non-standard bodies. Any disabled body, any person who is using crutches or a wheelchair is often miscategorized by these systems. And these things can then be used as further data for the systems to try to learn from, which then unfortunately the errors that the system will make in that process then get operationalized by the humans making use of these systems, and oftentimes has hazardous, disastrous, and even life-threatening consequences for the people who are subject to them.
Uh, this is Crystal. I totally agree 100% with what Damien is saying. I feel like this will actually be like a recurring theme throughout this conversation where I just like, it's like a call and response. Damien will say something and then I'll just agree and try to add more things on top of his already rich description. Yeah, I guess I will try to take a crack too at the like AI technologies can be helpful thing, just because I feel like it feels like a social responsibility. I guess I'll echo the call for data for Black Lives and then also add the Algorithmic Justice League and the kind of work that they're doing there, uncovering like or trying to dismantle white supremacy in machine learning systems like facial recognition. I guess I want to kind of give an example maybe of like AI technologies that like on its face actually provide access, but also have this like sinister, pernicious nature. So I guess the two that I thought of are like first voice agents. So I'm thinking about things like Siri, where theoretically, like if you have like a Internet of Things connected system in your house, like it could be really effective, especially for people with physical impairments, to be able to turn on their lights automatically or have like their temperature regulated in a ways that makes them more comfortable when they're having an episode. Like I think there are lots of ways in which this kind of voice agent can really help people navigate the world in a more accessible way. But if we're really trying, but if we kind of think about it and probe a little harder in terms of like the ways that it is harmful and violent, I mean, a lot of voice technology, especially in China, is trained on Uyghur people who are being like incarcerated and tortured, and like all of their biometric data is being taken en masse. And this is how a lot of those systems are being trained. In terms of like users, voice agents are notoriously very bad at detecting any accent that is non-standard. And we can talk more about like what that means, but I think like the kind of difference between like the normate and the disabled body is something that I think people in this chat are like obviously really invested in thinking about. But I guess like what was the other technology that I was thinking of? Oh, OCR. So the OCR is optical character recognition. So it's the kind of technology that like if you're scanning a book, for example, it will like automatically read the image of the letters and basically translate them into text that you could basically copy and paste, for example, and like into plain text. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, OCR gives enormous potential for access in the sense that if you have like mass scanning of books that aren't otherwise available in a screen reader friendly fashion, like OCR enables that. I think for a lot of folks too, like OCR combined with the screen reader makes like text more accessible, especially if you have dyslexia, have visual impairments. Like there's so many possibilities in terms of making texts that are available in person accessible to people on the other side of the globe too. On the other hand, I think it gets into real questions about infrastructure, availability of internet, availability of like digital devices, but also like if we want to think more broadly about what actually gets digitized. As Damien was talking about earlier, there are values built into all of these systems, and there are values built into what people choose to think is important and like label as such, so that it then goes through this process. Like I think if you think about something like Google Books, certain books will be prioritized for digitization and others will not. And I think for a lot of those books, it probably like disabled authors, authors of color, authors with multiply marginalized identities, like often, like it's already hard for these communities to get published in the first place. And then on top of that, you know, be deemed important enough to be digitized And then for mass access, I think is another layer of discrimination and horribleness that I think become really embedded in these technologies once you just kind of like dig a little bit deeper.
This is Damien
This
again.
is Lydia. Go ahead, Damien.
Oh, sorry. I was going to, this is Damien again. I was just going to go ahead and agree with Crystal and say that, yeah, one of the wonderful things about OCR is I concentrate better on a text when I can both read it visually and listen to it. And, with certain screen reader capabilities, I can do both of those at the same time. But the number of times I have to go in and OCR something that was not made available in a screen reader format, even if it was already in a PDF format, even if it was already in an EPUB format, that the number of times I have to go in and make those changes and make those edits myself says something very clear about who was, envisioned, who was idealized as the person who would be accessing this text. And yeah, that is definitely a conversation that needs to be had more often and more thoroughly within publishing houses, within writers groups, especially when we're talking about books that in many cases are about marginalization and technology.
This is Lydia. I appreciate the massive coffee cup. I hope you have something good in there. I want to ask now, shifting our conversation, what interventions do disability justice in the emergent field of Crip Technoscience, named first in Aimi, Hamraie, and Kelly Fritsch's manifesto, make into conversations about AI and the future of technology?
This is Damien. One of the things that I really appreciated about Hamraie and Fritsch's Crip Technoscience manifesto was the recentering of the notion of like design justice and the idea of what it meant to not just have a user-centered design experience, but to have an inclusive and just design experience. Something that says, don't just poll people who are going to be subject to the things you make, but center them as partners in the design, center their knowledge and their experience at the outset. And I think that that is kind of one of the fundamental things that I have taken from it when I think about what needs to be done in AI. When we talk about algorithmic systems, when we talk about big data systems, this notion of not just thinking and imagining forward to what the implications might be for a group on whom these technologies are used, but actually centering those people, reaching out to those communities and making them partners, not just people you poll for their input, but saying, this is something that is most likely to be used on communities of color, on disabled communities. These systems will be used to determine the benefits of poor people, of disabled people, of people who will be made subject to the criminal justice system in the United States, right? Like all of these questions can be asked directly to the people who will have to live them. And those responses, those experiences, that lived knowledge is something that we then take, not just extractively, not just taking it out of people, but saying, bring in this knowledge, bring in these people, bring them into community and into conversation, and give them the ability to actually shape these tools, to design these tools such that they can say, if you use this way, if you build this way, it will be used on me in X, Y, and Z ways. One of the things that I was thinking about earlier, Crystal, when you were talking about the training of voice recognition systems in China on the Uyghur population, one of the things that I was also thinking about was the way that like certain groups have been trying to make facial recognition that they say can detect gay people. And I'm like, that seems just like an on its face terrible idea. And if you were or asked any single person in the queer community with any LGBTQIA identity whatsoever, they would tell you this is a terrible idea. The idea that you can, one, detect someone's lived experiential identity by their face is phrenology, and it's been debunked, and it needs to go back in the garbage where it belongs. But two, even the notion that you might be able to is going to be made use of in a way that will be inherently oppressive. When there are cultures that exist right now where being gay can get you killed, why would you propose to make a tool that could make that oppressive and deadly usage easier? And if you, again, asked anyone who lived that experience, they would have said right up front, don't do this, it's bad. You make a tool that says that you can better predict crime. You ask any Black or brown person who is subject to enhanced surveillance in the United States based on the color of their skin, they'll tell you, yeah, that's going to get used on my community. You're going to predict crime more often in my communities, not where crime is actually happening, because you've defined de facto this culture, this society has defined my community as criminal already. So that's where they're going to look for the thing that they're going to try to predict. And it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so that's the kind of the main intervention that I've taken from the Crip Technoscience manifestos, is using that both specifically in the disability justice sphere that they initially intended it for, but seeing what other marginalized identities and lived experiences it can, that framework can be applied to.
This is Crystal. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm just going to sit for a second with what Damien has said and just like really internalize all the like awesome sparkly bits. Yeah. Okay. So I feel like there are two things that I kind of want to jam with. Like one is, this like broader question about Crip Technoscience. I'm going to put that on hold for a second, just because I feel like Damien really said something about facial recognition that I want to chew on more. So like this entire discussion about like identifying homosexuality, this kind of like new phrenology, like makes me think a lot about a paper that was written by Os Keys about identifying autism. And there's a lot of really interesting work on this kind of like facial recognition work, like AI data tagging work on like communities. Okay, I'm gonna take a breather there for a second. Okay, so I'm thinking a lot about this paper by Os Keys and other folks too when it comes to thinking about facial recognition and detecting either homosexuality, disability, autism, etc. And what they really do in the paper that I'm thinking about right now, and the title escapes me, is this distinction between identifying autism, or like identifying, X identity, as if like one could abstract identity from facial characteristics, and like labeling with disability. So, obviously there are like technologies that try to detect this, but they also talk about like technology firms and labor workforces that are trying to use people with disabilities in order to create the technology. So like employing autistic people, for example, to do IT work because somehow they're more they have like a higher attention to detail, or they come up with all these sort of like naturalizing and essentializing characteristics of what it means to be like a good autistic person, and then talks about how they are uniquely capable of doing some job, often related to technology, like whether it's IT or data tagging. I think there's a larger conversation to be had there about like employment opportunities, disability, and like the way that disabled folks are really marginalized in the US that makes them have one of the highest like rates of unemployment. So this is like a completely separate conversation. But I think there's something that's really interesting to me about how a lot of technology companies, particularly in China and in the US, who are essentially trying to kind of fetishize disabled folks and like their ability to like do magic with technology that somehow makes it better, but without centering their experience whatsoever. And I think there's something really pernicious there in terms of like both the way that these technologies and these services are marketed, but also the way that labor can often be seen as charity, for example, rather than something that is valuable. And I mean, here I'm thinking a lot about the work of Dee Wu, who's also a PhD candidate at MIT, who has done a lot of substantial ethnography about the way that data is tagged in AI systems in China, where there are these like really interesting dynamics about employment, labor, who gets to work, who's good at working, like what kinds of characteristics make a good worker that go into the making of all of these technologies that I think are really, really interesting and would love to explore further, both in this session and otherwise. All this to say, I feel like there's a lot of jumble here and I'm trying to make sense of it.
This is Lydia. I have two last questions for both of you, and I'm really excited about what each of you will have to offer. And one of them we hadn't actually talked about, so forgive me for springing it on you a little bit. But I wonder, we spend so much of our time as advocates, rightfully, picking apart what is wrong and harmful and oppressive, calling attention to and naming wrong. And we need to do that. We absolutely have to keep continuing to do that. But we also have to think about, and I know we are all doing this in different ways, what the world would look like if oppression didn't exist. And that idea is very much encapsulated in the title of your website, Damien, a future worth thinking about. And so when I think about what kind of a future do we want to live in, what ought the world to be like, I'm thinking about if we had systems that actually worked for people instead of profit, systems that recognized humanity instead of denying personhood, systems that valued all of us in our complexity and our wholeness. What would that be like? I want to ask you, if we're thinking about technological design and development and the increased usage of AI technologies, what would it actually look like to be building technological systems, processes, and programs that were not just about furthering justice, but about sustaining it? What would a just world look like in its development of technology?
This is Crystal. What an incredible question. I will practice humility and say that I don't have the answer. I would say about sustaining justice. I guess here I like really turn to the work of Sasha Constanza-Chalk and the way that they've really been able to conceptualize design justice as something that centers communities in a way that doesn't fall into like a kind of stakeholderism, as if like, you need to get all the different stakeholders at the table, then we can make like good decisions, as if like everyone is equal. when in reality, like people are on such uneven playing fields because of the way that power works in society. I mean, I guess like centering communities, centering disabled people, like this is all I think like a first step, but like necessary but insufficient in my mind. But I mean, like really, maybe this is a cop out, but like I think it requires radically imagining a society that like it's not just about technology, but it's about radically reimagining society in a way that thinks about alternative modes of like thinking about value and thinking about humans and centering them in ways that like center care. And when it comes to like designing technology, like in order to get at the speculative fiction, I mean, I guess that I don't mean to speak for the other people here, but I think this is like a life project. And I think like a journey that we're still going on. And I'm so happy to be on that journey with you all.
This is Damien, and I 100% agree with everything that Crystal just said. I absolutely believe that it is a lifelong and society-wide practice and project of reframing and re-understanding what it means to be people in community together, right? And so far as how do we weave that into the technologies that we're trying to create, that question is it is such a fantastic question, and it's the question that I keep trying to get at and trying to dig something out of, every day in my work as well. And again, like I'm also very happy to be in this company doing that work. It is a matter of, I guess, understanding how we put our values into the systems that we build in the first place, both technological and social, and how we accidentally, repeatedly, all day, every day, put our values into those places, understanding that so that we can do it intentionally. And so what that then looks like is the practice of asking ourselves what values we're embedding into these systems, asking ourselves what beliefs we hold while we try to do this work, being critical about those power imbalances and saying, yes, in order to have justice, in order to have something that allows for a just society wherein the harms of the past are repaired, as well as ensuring some kind of equality of understanding and opportunity into the future, there will be a moment, and this kind of goes back to your very first question, Lydia, there will be a moment where fairness is not enough. If fairness is understood as just giving everybody the same amount, as giving everyone the same access, as you said, Crystal, that does not account for the reality, the lived experience of the fact that, if I'm in a hole 20 feet deep and you're in a hole 10 feet deep and everybody gets a 8-foot ladder, that's not, some of us aren't getting out of the hole we're in. So we have to make sure that we recognize what's actually going to repair, it's actually going to help, what's actually going to enable us to make the changes, make the balances, make the justice that we need. And that requires us having the hard conversations. It requires us doing the difficult work. It requires us doing the real interrogation of our values and of the status and the lived experiences that we all currently hold.
This is Lydia. I really appreciate both of your thoughts and your offerings about this. And I want to offer too that dreaming and thinking through what the future will and should be like if it were just is messy. and unpredictable. And I don't think I have those answers either. And I would hazard to say, anyone who claims that they have all those answers, I would be very wary of. I wouldn't necessarily feel all that comfortable collaborating with that person who claims they know exactly everything that we all need to be doing and exactly what things should look like. I also don't know that there will just be one way for things to be. I think that prescriptive approaches that presume only one way of doing things are still rooted in very white-centric colonizing modes of thought, not to mention profoundly ableist ones that assume there's only one right way for people's bodies to move and only one right way for societies to operate. I don't think that way of thinking has a good place in liberation-focused political organizing and visioning. And that brings me to my last and final question for you. Both of you belong to directly impacted, multiply marginalized communities. And that's part of why I've been drawn to do work with and be in conversation with both of you. I want to be in conversation with people who have experiences that are similar to or parallel to mine, and who are nonetheless pushing back against harmful, oppressive institutions that we often must work within anyway. What does it mean for you to be undertaking this work, coming from a perspective of marginalization and oppression? How do you sustain yourselves in this work? In what ways does community sustain you?
This is Crystal. What does it mean to do this work? I mean, I don't mean to be like a Debbie Downer all the time. I think what it means to do this work for other people who are interested in it means like being really sad a lot of the time, being angry a lot of the time, having to kind of sit with like fear, anger, sadness, frustration, I think, both at like the systems that have kind of created this, but also just like the systems of academia that are like not well suited to this kind of work, both in terms of, I think, advocating for like diversity, inclusion, like whatever catchwords you want to use in order to describe like AI ethics or fairness. I mean, I think there's a real commodification of this kind of work and like a capture, I think, in a way that, like on the one hand, you're talking about like accountability, fairness, or whatever. And on the other hand, what they're really talking about is like optimizing the tech to prison pipeline. And so like, I think it's hard, not just in terms of like actually doing the work, like doing the research, but then there's like the additional layer of like doing it within like ableist academia and like trying to fight two battles at the same time. At the same time, I feel like what it means to undertake this work for me is like being in like community with people like Damien and Lydia, and like finding these communities of care who are thinking about the same things, pushing me to think better, be like to really expand what I think is possible and what I find to be interesting, or like things just like that I haven't never thought about. I think having these communities who like share common interests and common goals, but have different perspectives and push me to think about those things in different ways, but also like, hold me and care for me when I am like deep in despair or like getting harassed, like having people like just have my back on some of these things, I think has been really, really overwhelming and helpful. And I think this particular seminar is a really good example of that, where like I'm just with cool people and just jamming. And I feel like that does a lot for me, both in terms of doing this research, but personally too.
This is Damien. 100% agreed again. The need for community the being able to work with people who understand that lived experience and the the variedness of our lived experience, the variation of the fact that we're not all experiencing exactly the same thing because we are all different, and our overlaps, the intersections of our marginalization are all different, but there's a similarity of shape to the experience and the feeling that we have when we're under that scrutiny, when we're in that space. And yeah, I do unfortunately think that it is about recognizing that we will be angry, unfortunately, a lot while we do this work, because so much of this work is about pointing out what's wrong, as Lydia mentioned earlier, but also, as they said earlier, looking to understand what it is we want it to be like, and arguing for that, pushing for that, working together, building a community. So much of what I think of when I do this work, the comedian Wyatt Cenac wrote an article called "On Being the Only One in the Room," and he talked about his experience of being the only Black person in comedy writers' rooms for various TV shows. And he related that to, it's not always just you're the only Black person. Sometimes you're the only woman, you're the only disabled person, you're the you're the only person with an LGBTQ identity, any number of things. But the effect is the same. You feel like you have to simultaneously bear the brunt of every single question that anyone has about whatever your lived experience, your lived identity is, but also do the work of representing that entire breadth and depth and scope of lived experience for these people who otherwise might not get it. And when I do this work in groups of people who oftentimes are not disabled, are not people of color, are not multiply marginalized in the way that so many of us here in this conversation are, who simply do not have the lived experience to draw from, so much of the work that gets done is about explaining in detail something that is intimately lived, and so it's hard to conceptualize, hard to intellectualize out, because it is so it's like swimming, it's like moving and breathing so much, right? And so being able to go from being the only one in the room to being in a room full of us, to building a community in which we say it's not going to be just one of us in that room in the future. The next time we're going to build that room, the next time we're going to build we're going to build that guest list, and to say this isn't just about access and inclusion, this is a diversity and inclusion initiative, it's a an equity and justice thing. It's about not just having a stake, it's about defining what the stakes ought to be in the first place. And so doing this work is about recognizing that my frustration, my sadness, my anger, those are valid, but that I also have to have and have to make use of the community that both offers itself to me, but that I have also taken pains to build with all of you and with others who are trying to do this work.
Damien and Crystal, I am so appreciative of both of your work and of the chance to be in community with both of you. For those who are just tuning in, I actually only met Damien and Crystal both within the past year and a half. And even in that short time, I have become grateful for and deeply appreciative of what they do in our communities and in their scholarship. I appreciate your time with us, and we will turn this time over now for a live Q&A with our participants. Before we do so, one last very important question. Damien, are your cats there? Where are they?
This is Damien. Unfortunately, both of my cats seem to be asleep, and the other room is far. I would bring them onto the screen if I could, but unfortunately, they don't seem to want to play right now. However, we do have Leica in the screen again. Hello.
Hello, wonderful doggo. This is Lydia.
Hello.
We love
Hello.
seeing Doggo. She is so happy and squirmy. Thank you for sharing her with us, Crystal. She is a gift. And with that, we'll turn it over to Q&A. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Damien. So I know that Lydia is on their way. And so I guess we can manage the Q&A. So for all of you who have questions, could you put them in the Q&A box so that it's a little bit easier for us to manage? Because otherwise I was a little overwhelmed by the chat, and I imagine Damien was too. But maybe Damien, if it's okay, I will ask you the first question, and then we can kind of riff from there. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. Yeah. So the first question from Carolyn is, can bias be used to counter bias? And do you think that no bias connects to universalism rather than difference?
That is a very good and a very important question. So one of the things that I kind of try to think about in thinking about when we do talk about the bias question, as we were discussing earlier, can we use the values that we have to kind of interrogate the values that are present? And there are definitely a couple of people who are in this chat right now, I know, who are thinking in that space. Researchers like Jonathan Flowers have proposed ideas about using these systems to kind of highlight the bias, placing them in a running state and then seeing what biases get exacerbated and what gets popped out, so that we can get an understanding of exactly what's been built into them in the first place. And that's one way to go about it, and that gives us the space to really think about what it is we've built, how we've built it, and again, that space of what notions, what values have we embedded unintentionally in these systems, so that we can do a better job of embedding them intentionally, embedding the values that we want to see in these systems, and doing so on purpose, rather than just being subject to the accidents that we've made. So far as the universalism question aspect of the question, if I'm understanding it correctly, this idea that there might be a way to kind of combine the multiple different perspectives that people might have, the multiple different sets of values that we've, and this is some of the conversation that I've seen in the chat as well, making space for multiple different perspectives and multiple different values, rather than trying to say there's one right way, one universalizable way. I take a lot of my cue for that from things like standpoint feminism, the idea of situated knowledge, this notion that you don't get anything like a capital O objectivity. You don't get a capital T truth. You get multiple different viewpoints on the nature of things, and somewhere, in intentionally putting those viewpoints together in conversation with each other, you can get at a clearer and more robust picture of the way the world is.
Yeah, I totally agree. That was so eloquently put. Oh, by the way, this is Crystal. So, I mean, I guess like another way that I've kind of thought about no bias and universalism is that I think the emphasis on trying to de-bias systems and to search for no bias kind of reminds me of people who are trying to create colorblind futures or like colorblind diversity initiatives, as if like at some point we can just no longer see race, so we can no longer see bias in AI systems. So I mean, I guess yes to the question in the sense that I think ideas about like debiasing to the point that there is no bias kind of connects to that kind of universalism and just effaces the differences that exist between us and that become embedded within AI systems. So I guess we can, I don't know how you want to do this, Damien. I can keep on just asking
No,
questions.
I was gonna switch off, and I was gonna ask you the next one.
Yeah, sure, great.
We have one from Larissa Mann. How are people thinking about design justice or use of technology that also accounts for people making the resources and the environmental impact? How, especially to escape the kind of supposed trade-offs assumed to be forced on technology users versus technology makers, or say coltan miners?
Oh man, what a question. I'm gonna have to marinate on that a little bit. So I will pause. But I mean, to the second part of the question about assumed trade-offs between technology users and makers, I mean, I think that one way to break this down is to say that like I think it would bring up a false division between like disabled users of technology and like theoretically able-bodied makers, when in reality there are disabled makers and users at the same time. And so I feel like I'm really trying to kind of collapse these categories to kind of talk about how users and makers can often be the same person. There was another part of the question. Design justice for like resources and environmental impact. I mean, I would say that thinking about ecologies of people and the environments around them are like very key to thinking about design justice. So, like, I mean, I think environmental degradation affects different people in different ways, and so being attuned to that as like part of people's experience is a really important component of design justice. And I would love to hear anything that you have to add too about that, Damien.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One of the key things that when I was teaching intro to philosophy many years ago, but when I was teaching it, we would have conversations about technological ethics, right? We would talk about the realms of impact and unintended consequences of certain things in the world. Coltan mining was one of the key and crucial things that we would talk about. We would speak about the fact that the processes which make for convenience in the world at scale are also processes which outsizedly affect already marginalized and oppressed populations. And so we would have this conversation of how do you mitigate and balance the fact that there is this outsized disproportional effect, and that's kind of the crux of it. Is we have to consider it at the outset, as we've talked about this whole time. It can't be an after the fact kind of consideration. It has to be something that we think about, try to understand, and if we realize that we ourselves don't have the scope and frame of reference to properly understand, we bring in those communities directly, and then we get into the habit of doing that first and foremost. We bring in the communities who will most be affected by this, and we try to envision a way that doesn't have these trade-offs, that doesn't have to be a zero-sum calculation about, well, somebody's got to lose in order for somebody else to win. That's not necessarily true. It's simply the nature of the system that we have put ourselves into and then reinscribed and reinforced over and over and over again, such that we now think of it as the only possible way forward. There are other non-zero sum ways of design, of achieving justice, of building systems of interaction and community and society. And so, envisioning those at the outset, aiming for those at the outset is kind of crucial if we want something like justice.
Oh, thank you. This is Crystal. Thanks so much for that, Damien. I have a follow-up question that I think I can draw directly to the point that you just made. So the question comes from Hani Auni, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And they ask, how have approaches to technology differed in spaces that are currently trying to build equitable societies that challenge colonialist and racialized capitalistic systems? So the examples that they bring up are Zapatistas and cooperative networks in Humboldt and Jackson.
Yeah. So we can see examples of, groups who take on projects that are more community focused, that adapt or reappropriate systems that exist or that have been imposed upon them. There's a researcher at Virginia Tech, Fabian Prieto Nanez, who does work on talking about like how even things like pirate stations in Central and South America have a kind of colonialist or decolonialist vector, and thinking about the ways that like this kind of self-directed drive towards the use and the development of these technologies is different from the work that is otherwise imposed upon them by state media. So you can kind of think in terms of these tools, and I think this gets to a couple of the other questions that we've seen in the Q&A section as well. There are ways to push back against the existing order, right? Like the status quo. There are ways to resist it and to still be doing technology that is otherwise, I guess, recognizable to the rest of the world as technological innovation, where innovation has that capital I innovation and it's seen as like an inherent good somehow. But it's, if you think about, again, bringing those communities in at the outset, we can find these examples of people who are developing these tools, who are doing work that pushes back against imposition in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the follow-up answer that I'll have there that I think sort of gets at the question that Skylar Whitaker is asking about what a global perspective on design justice would look like. So I'll answer kind of both of those together. I think I can think of two really good works that point to some of these answers. The first is Rodrigo Oshigame's work on informatics in Latin America. His name is Ochigame. And he kind of chronicles a kind of alternate history of cybernetics and computing in Latin America, specifically Cuba. And then the other example that I was going to bring up is Lily Arani, that's Irani's work on innovation in India. And I think when it comes to redefining and rethinking what a global perspective would look like, I think part one is just redefining what innovation is, and the kind of metrics by which we think about something as being successful. So instead of centering economic value and profit, centering care and community, for example. So I mean, I guess that's kind of where I would first think of. I know that I have other examples in my head that hopefully will pop up later. But Damien, do you want to ask another question?
Yeah. So there's a question that comes in here of it was one of the first ones. It was asked while we were still in the middle of the opening discussion from Carolyn Ward, and the thinking of Edouard Glissant's concept of opacity, and that transparency is not always a good thing, and that it can be used to serve whiteness. I wonder what is better, to be recognized by facial technology or to not be recognized?
So I guess this is Crystal, I will toot my own horn and say that I have written a piece about this that was published in Slate. I can recapitulate some of the main points here, but essentially, I think the problem with facial recognition and thinking about ethics in technology is that often you have this double bind. And I think Carolyn talks about that very eloquently. And I mean, I think like to be recognized often means that this kind of work will, this kind of technology will incarcerate you. And then if you have more and more people kind of entered into this data set to like de-bias it or to increase diversity, it often just means that the system is now just more efficient at incarcerating people, in the case of facial recognition. And I mean, I think like we can talk about facial recognition as something that is imperfect, which is why I think a lot of the problems around mass incarceration arise with facial recognition. But I would argue that even if the system were perfect, it would still be a harmful system. And I mean, I think there are lots of reasons that we can go to about that. So like we can talk about like the technical aspects of whether or not that's possible or whether it's even desirable. But I mean, I think in the discussion previously, we kind of talked about cases in which like A, it will never be perfect, and B, even if it were, it just makes current structures of oppression faster and better.
No, that's exactly it. You know, when I think about that question, I think about you know, Simone Brown's work in Dark Matters, and I think about like the question of what it is to be made visible, right? To be made legible by these systems. So yeah, as you point to, like that question of it's just going to make the oppression faster and worse, right? It doesn't, you know. I think it was 2016. Claire Garvey, Alvaro Bedoya, a couple of other people at Georgetown were looking at like this big report called the Perpetual Lineup, right? And one of the main findings of it was that the facial recognition technology that is deployed most often on the communities that it sees less well, right? So it's deployed most often on Black and Brown communities, as I noted, and it sees them less well. So it's just this constant recapitulation of error. But the follow-on understanding is not make it better so you can continue to deploy it against them. It is that even if it were more carefully refined, the values from which it is deployed, the purposes to which it is put, will still be those oppressive, racialized purposes, wherein, again, predictive policing and facial recognition are going to be more likely to be used on communities that are already deemed more likely to be criminal, which in Western society, and specifically in the United States of America, is overwhelmingly Black and Brown communities, because this society has a long history of tying criminality and notions of criminality to skin tone, to ethnicity, to the notions of race, and binding those things together so as to make it easier to exclude those populations from full participation within civic society. That has a long and chronicled history, right? And it ranges from everything from policing to, you know, housing applications. So yeah, no, making facial recognition better doesn't make it better. Making it more accurate doesn't make it better, is what I should say there. And so I think the question of, is it better to be seen less well, or is it better to be seen more clearly? Neither. Until the technology is put to purposes and deployed from a value set that doesn't reinforce and reinscribe those values over and over again, neither is good.
This is Crystal. Yeah, neither is good. What is the future? These are all million-dollar questions. I guess the next question that comes from Daniel is really important. Where is assistive technology in this discussion?
Yeah. So this is Damien. There are a number of really great people doing really interesting work on the question of how assistive technology fits into this. Alice Wong, Jeffrey Beardy, Ashley Shu are all looking at how assistive technologies and disabled users, disabled technology users of technology that isn't necessarily deemed assistive at the outset, but is within the community seen as assistive. These questions are crucial because it gets to who's doing the designing of these technologies. And again, who's deploying them and who's directing their use. Because very often technology that is designated as assistive tech isn't designed by disabled users, right? It isn't designed by people who have the close familiarity and the lived experience of what that technology is actually going to be like in their lives, what it's going to do when it's put to use. And so there's a lot of people who have a lot of ideas about what they think will be good, what they think will be the best use, but have never actually had to use it. Who've never actually sat in a wheelchair, never actually used crutches, never actually tried to fit a hearing aid in, right? And so that question of how are these things designed, how are they built, how are they developed, and how are they deployed, usually not with the community in question in mind. And that's one of the fundamental things that needs to change.
This is Crystal. Before I continue, I have a message from Lydia that one of the interpreters needs to go. Could I get some confirmation about that?
I'm the only one here, so I'm not sure what that is.
Thought I saw.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought I saw that we had two as well at one point. So perhaps the other person already left.
Okay.
I don't.
Okay.
Either
Sorry
way, glad to
about
have you
that.
with us. Thank you for being here.
Yeah. Likewise. Yeah, sorry. This is Crystal. I was a little bit distracted by that. Yeah, so continuing on with the question about assistive technology. I guess, as Damien said, I am inspired a great deal by the work of Ashley Shew, S-H-E-W. I guess the other person that I would bring up here is Sarah Hendren, H-E-N-D-R-E-N. And she has a really, really great piece actually that is titled "All Technology is Assistive." And I think there's a lot to say about the article, and it's very short and easily digestible. But essentially her argument is that we shouldn't think of them somehow as separate, like, a computer mouse or a keyboard, for example, like extends my ability to engage with information. And what is that other than assistive technology? And I mean, I think especially the idea of like conceiving of technologies as like extending human ability, what is that other than a prosthetic? And so using these kind of frameworks to reshape the way that we interact with and think about technology, I think is really, really important. So all this to say, like, I think we should naturalize thinking about technologies as assistive, and therefore we should naturalize thinking about disabled people as users and makers of these technologies. Yeah, shall we continue with the questions, Damien?
Yes. So the next question, seeing a number of really interesting ones, trying to get to a couple that we haven't, like that hit areas that we haven't covered yet. So we have one from Zhuang Zhang. What are your opinions on how research on the downside / limitations of certain AI methods, techniques, applications is received in academic spaces? What are some of the ways to engage stakeholders like those who are at the forefront of developing or envisioning AI techniques, methods, applications on these drawbacks that you've seen work? So the question being, how do we get people to, I guess, take more kindly to the fact that sometimes we do have to point out that there are drawbacks and limitations to the tools and techniques that they're using, and how do we get them to take that critique seriously and really engage with it?
Yeah. Oh man. Let me. I have to do a big think on this question. Um, how is this research received in academic spaces? Well, I don't know if this gets at the spirit of the question, but I think a lot of this research on how AI has problems has been met with a great deal of resistance in academic spaces. And I think the dismissal of both Margaret Mitchell and Timnit Gebru, Gebru, at Google is very good evidence of how hostile a lot of academic and industry spaces are to thinking about AI as something that's not this golden technology which will bring us to the future. So all this to say, I think this work is difficult to do also because the incentives for doing it are not very good. But in terms of ways to engage stakeholders who are at the forefront of developing AI, I guess my cynical take is that sometimes it's very hard because they just don't care. And I don't know how to make people care about the well-being of other people. It's hard to get people to see you as human if they dismiss you as lesser than at the outset. So, I mean, I guess that's the kind of cynical, pessimistic take that I have. The maybe more optimistic one is that I think there are a lot of great people that we're in community with who are doing this kind of work and are really effective at it and are getting a lot of very well-deserved acclaim for it. And Damien is one of those people.
Well, thank you. I don't know how much of like either the acclaim or the well-deserved, but I am happy to have these conversations with you and Lydia and anybody else who wants to have these conversations, because as I said earlier, it makes it easier to do this work when you know that there are people who are there with you, sitting with you in this community. So yeah, I do think that that question, that conundrum that you posed earlier, I don't know how to get people to think that they should care about people when they don't. Like it's so fundamental to me at the outset that it's like, oh, obviously that's good, but if it just doesn't occur to someone to think that way at the beginning, I don't know how to say that it's good other than that it's good. You know, there's only so much that I can do to connect it to cost benefit analyses, to connect it to profit margins, to connect it to, you know, the smoother functioning and higher efficiency of their organization before it starts to feel like I'm just pushing against a willful dismissal of the notion that it is a good thing to do, right? But I think that there are ways to, if you can find the thing that they value and get them to interrogate that value, get them to ask how the conversation that we are all trying to have here today connects up to that value. Yeah, this is one of those places one of the rare places I kind of advocate for the kind of old school Socratic method. You know, get people to ask themselves questions that they might not otherwise want to ask themselves, but which have, you know, somewhat obvious answers until they connect up the whole set of those answers and see that they've painted themselves a picture that says, this is why you should care about this then. And this is what it means to really value all of the things that you said you just valued. And here's how we can do that together from here. Uh, it's not a guarantee. It's not a, you know, a 100% definite end all be all plan, but it's one methodology I have found can work. It's just it doesn't scale very well. It's hard to have those conversations big and in public. Hani, who asked one of the questions earlier, and I were actually having this conversation a couple of weeks ago. It's hard to do that talk when those people feel like they're being judged on their answers, because they'll get defensive a lot more easily. But doing it one-on-one in the much more effective one-on-one scale takes forever. And it's hard to feel like we have enough time to really do that way. So yeah, this is all a long way of saying it's difficult and I don't have a perfect solution for it. And I really wish that I did. So if anybody has better suggestions, let's workshop them. Let's put them together and see what we can work out.
This is
Yeah.
Lydia. I would love to be able to say that we could find those perfect solutions, but I think that would be making claims that are far outside the bounds of any of our capacity here. It has been such a joy and a pleasure to be able to listen to both of you and participate in part of this conversation. And for all of you who've joined us today, if you are not yet following Crystal and Damien's vital work, I strongly encourage you to do so. Both of them are everywhere to be found online. And I hope you've been following the conversation as well on our Twitter on hashtag liberating webinars. We hope that you will also consider joining us on Sunday for our next program, Disrupting Ableism and Racism in School Trauma. And next Wednesday, Health Justice is Disability Justice, Disabled Perspectives in Public Health, Research, Policy, and Advocacy. Thank you again to Damien, to Crystal, and to our interpretation and captioning team members as well.
This is Crystal. Thank you so much. And thanks for all these questions. I'm so sorry that we didn't get to answer so many of them. But thanks for giving us the opportunity to talk.
This is Damien. Yeah, thank you both so much. Thank you to the ASL and the caption interpreters. Thank you so much for your work today. And yeah, to all of you asking questions, I'm sorry that we did not get a chance to answer all of them. They're very important and very trenchant questions that get to a lot of kind of crucial components of this work. So thank you all for being here. I hope that we do get the opportunity to talk and think together like this again in the near future.